Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen, and I'm back with the examples that I promised you on some more logic models and also how to build them. So this is part 3 of Intro to Logic Models. Let's look at this example first though. So this one's kind of more of a simplified version, but it works for its purpose. So they kind of just have resources, activities, and impact, and then they kind of say inputs, outputs, outcomes. And they prompt themselves with these little thought clouds that say what's invested, what's done, what are the changes or the benefits. Um, so essentially here, they kind of say, we have people, we have money, we have stuff, we have, some research and a head start in the game. We're going to offer workshops and seminars or training or do some mentoring. And we're going to get increases in knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And we're going to get changes in behavior and practices and maybe get some new applicants or a new program for a PhD program. So again, like this is a really watered down version. For a higher level grant that's like multi-million dollar, this probably isn't going to cut it. But for something that you're just trying to show someone an overview of what you're going to do, this would probably be sufficient, although I would probably put more detail in it. But it can be as simple as this. So again, you don't have to try to write a dissertation through a logic model. So just keep that in mind. Here's another example. This is example 2. So here we have program action. So they have their inputs, their outputs, and their outcomes, and they kind of broke them down similarly to how I did it, where you have short-term, medium, or intermediate, and long-term, which would essentially be your impacts. And this one, they kind of talked about situation and priorities. So right here, we can tell this logic model is really more of a theoretically based logic model, where they kind of felt the need to justify and kind of get after some of the needs and the priorities before they even get into what they're bringing to the table and the activities they're going to do. So yeah, and then they have kind of some arrows. I don't know that these arrows are terribly useful at the bottom. They're trying to show interaction between their assumptions and the evaluation that they're going to do. And they have this big bar of evaluation at the bottom to kind of show, hey, we're going to evaluate the whole time as we go. So in a way, they kind of are blending a theory approach and an outcomes approach because and actually an activities approach where they're kind of doing formative evaluation and kind of taking stock of the journey and evaluating the activities as it happens. So this is a blend of a couple different ones. But again, realize there's a lot of ways to do this. They use different colors, different shapes, but you should be able to kind of get after the what, the how, the why, and kind of have a list of things to think about. So you can use this as kind of a rough draft. But let's go through those basic components one more time so you feel really certain how this is going to come together. So first we're going to talk about the basic components of the logic model. I like to focus on outcomes because sometimes that's the taxing part to go, okay, what are my goals? What am I really trying to do? So when you focus on outcomes, again, you expect that these activities will lead to changes in 1 to 3 years or 4 to 6 years. This is what you want to think about. So when you talk about outcomes, sometimes reverse thinking is required. What results do I expect? So think outcomes first. Again, start with the end in mind. And remember to adhere to those SMART goals. If you're going to have these results, make sure they're specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timely. So you can make sure that you can do evaluation on them at the end. Okay, so again here, outcomes are those specific changes in attitudes, behavior, knowledge, skills, status, or a level of functioning expected to result from the activities. And we break them into long-term and short-term. So, over here, again, your earlier example in part 1, we talked about your YouTube video going viral. That is specific and measurable, where we can see how many views it has, and it's realistic. Someone filmed it. So we talk about, we have more of STEM units for classrooms. We teach people how to do this thing. It's going to increase a deeper understanding of how to teach. Maybe they're doing some training with teachers. So think about ultimately what you're trying to accomplish. And when you start with these goals in mind, it can drive a lot of the rest of what happens in the logic model. Okay, so let me take a moment just to clarify outcomes and outputs because they get confused all the time. So remember the differences between components of a logic model. So conducting an activity is not the same as achieving results from accomplishing that activity. So you have to separate the doing from the what happened, okay? So an output is the direct result of an activity, like a number of meetings or students enrolled or people trained or packages delivered. It's the what. The outcome is the results you expect to achieve over time, as a result of implementing the activity. So maybe it's family permanency, reduction in use of juvenile diversion in the court system, having safer pedestrian walkways. But maybe, like for example, for the pedestrian walkways, maybe the output was installing street lamps and changing sidewalks to be more pedestrian friendly. But ultimately, the goal is to make pedestrian walkways safer. So do you see how the actual result of doing something, number of streetlights installed, is totally different than the outcome or the goal of wanting to make things safer? So just make sure you include that separation. Then we can look at impacts, right? So those are even a little bit harder because it's like, whoo, what do I want to happen in 10 years? I don't really know. So it's really longer term thinking, right? So let's talk about impacts. So help with impacts. Again, consider 7 to 10 years, like within the next decade, what would we hope to try to do? And it's like, well, I don't know if my little grant is going to really get that far. It's the little engine that could. But in an idealistic world, it would be cool if it had an impact beyond just its little short shelf life. So think about improved conditions, increased capacity, or even policy changes, a new way of life, a new way of doing business, okay? So impacts are really collective, organizational, community, or system level changes expected to result from program activities. So they're very broad, large level changes, right? That impact a lot of people, right? So we see people emerging into a new career. We see you becoming an overnight dancing sensation, right? That included a lot of other people and a longer lasting effect. Okay, so that might help you think about how to do your impacts. Finally, we get into resources and inputs, and this is the stuff you need to be able to do your activities. This one's a little bit easier to come by because it's kind of obvious in some ways. But when you talk about resources and inputs, it can even be barriers, which may even potentially enable or limit program effectiveness. So it's a good exercise to go through to be like, oh, we're missing something. Actually, we don't have the server capacity to do that. Actually, we need more laptops. Or we ran out of building space. Or where are we going to put this? Right? We need storage. So essentially, when you talk about enabling or limiting resources, sometimes it's enabling would be funding, having existing organizations. So this is where you would want to list your community partners, people who collaborate with you, staff, time, equipment, supports, and supplies. Those that would be limiting would be obviously attitudes, a lack of resources, maybe not having agreeable policies or laws or regulations, or even just geography. It's not really as attainable given the physical space and constraints you have to work with. Again, these are some examples over here on the side. You have to put on your dancing shoes would be enabling, or you just don't have shoes. That would be the limiting. So maybe you got to go get some shoes. So another example, you put in some new curriculum into place. You have to go get staff to train people on a workshop. You have to get supplies for the workshop and training manuals. So those would be resources and inputs for your project. Rounding this out, we get into the activities, right? So what's this doing? What are you going to do, right? And this is where, again, a lot of your education is very crucial to working on your grant program. So hopefully in the classes that you took, when you've sought to address a social problem or a population need, you've been introduced to some of the best practices and some of the interventions that have happened in society to make changes. If you haven't by your professors, shame on them. They should have been doing that because it's basically putting research into practice. So they should show you obvious connections as to where we take an idea from research and somebody goes off and runs with it, right? So there was actually a program that took kids and it was called Moving to Opportunity. And it was a huge grant-based program that took kids out of underprivileged areas and moved them to more affluent areas. It kind of goes into that expression, you can take the ghetto out of the kid. Can you take the kid out of the ghetto? Like really challenging those assumptions and those ideas. Like, is this a cultural issue with the lifestyle of the inner city? Or is this, something more internal? Do we put the certain supports in place and certain opportunities? Will it make any changes for these kids that are long-term? And you should go look up that study, Moving to Opportunity. It had a lot of interesting results coming out of it. So they literally did kind of voluntary relocation of families and giving them stipends and places to live so they could go to nicer schools and have more access to things they needed to see if it really changed things for people. And in some ways it did, in some ways it didn't. But the activity was moving people and enrolling them in new institutions. It's a pretty grand and bold move, right? Because it's hard for people to just decide to move. But if they know they're getting opportunities and resources and advantages, then they might be willing to do that. But again, you should go back to the kinds of things you studied, the kinds of social problems or populations you're passionate about, and think about what are the interventions in that area that have come out recently or that people have tried. Maybe that's something that I want to do. Maybe it has to do with working with high-risk kids. Maybe it's intervening on behalf of refugees. Maybe it's trying a different approach or different ways of doing something. But again, this goes back to theory. How do you think this behavior or this social phenomenon actually works? So you may have to spend some time actually thinking through all this so that you can get after the doing and the activities that are necessary to accomplish it. So when you're thinking through activities, these are processes, tools, experiences, techniques, events, technology, but things that are active, right? Actions that are used to bring about desired results. So these can be things like products, making promotional materials or stuff or producing things, building educational curricula, services like education and training, or providing infrastructure like organizational structures, capacity, relationships, vouchers, stipends, subsidies. So that can be part of the activities, is awarding out those kinds of resources. And then again, we have examples. The activity would be you're going dancing with your friend. That's the thing you did, and then inevitably it led to other outcomes. Okay? So again, just more examples help with activities. The last part we're going to talk about here is outputs. Okay, so what is the result of what you did? Right? Once the activities are completed, it should produce a set of evidence or results that show us that it happened. So this is the what happened part. So when we talk about outputs, again, we want to think about that should say outputs, right? Outputs, I will quickly fix that. There we go. When we talk about outputs, outputs are the direct result of program activities. So they indicate if a program was delivered and if it actually went to the intended audience as planned. So this is your evidence. This is how you justify what you did. So essentially, you can look at the size and scope of services or products delivered. And a lot of times these take the form of counts or numbers or, increases or decreases or expansion, reduction, limitation, those kinds of words. So use that as your vocabulary to draw from. Number of classes taught, number of meetings held, number of people trained, materials or products produced, increases in participation rates, changes in the demography, changes in the population as far as of how that population's categorized or identified. Okay, so again, your output would be your dance move gets posted on YouTube and you would have a number of views that could basically be the result of your dancing, right? So people see it and this is how we know you danced. So again, think about outputs in terms of the effect of the activity. So how do we know the activity actually happened? What would be the way we demonstrate that? Okay, so again, I did in the earlier presentation, I talked about differences between outputs and outcomes. Make sure you don't make that mistake so that you feel very confident about how you define the what happened part of your grant. And then finally, just rounding out this presentation, these are the references I use to build the presentation. So these are presentations on evaluation and measuring outcomes and from different foundations that have been in the grant game for a really long time. So I thought you might want some of these references to use if you take this further. And then certainly there are some other helpful resources that you can use. So there actually are logic model books out there. There are teams that provide technical assistance to help people learn how to build them. There are tools, development tools out there. There are places that help you with the planning and design to help prompt you with the right questions of what you're going to do. So again, hopefully this was really helpful to you in encountering the world of logic models. Don't be afraid of them. Use them as a really creative way to map out your whole project. And as long as you adhere to the correct prompts and do the logical and heavy lifting thinking, the reasoning, it's going to actually help you write your grant application. So it's kind of like, don't put the cart before the horse. Map out your project first. before you actually write about your project. But sometimes you have to do a fair bit of preparation and planning before you do that. So don't be afraid to do that because it's going to pay off big time when you get ready to write the application. So put in the necessary effort you need for your logic model, and you will be rewarded with an easier to write grant application. We'll see you in the next lecture.